Hi everyone, welcome back to this ongoing series on A-level statistics from the Edexcel exam board. So in our previous video, we looked at a few important key terms from the specification that are important for exam, such as a statistic, a population, a sample, discrete and continuous quantitative data, right? So today's video, we are going to, and for the ongoing week, we are going to be focusing on population and more specifically sampling. Sampling is a key part of statistics as it is how most of the data used is obtained and it's also processed. So what is sampling, right? So sampling is simply the method of selecting a small group to represent the large population. If you have, let's say, the whole planet of people, right? You could say select, I don't know, like you could select a small number of people, say 5 or 10 people to represent them, right? Of course, the sample could be small and it might not be an accurate representation, but then we select a small group, we choose it so that they can represent all the data as accurately as possible. Of course, a sample is small, it's a small group of the larger population, so you cannot get always an accurate representation, all right? So there are two main types of samplings. There are more types of samplings, but we'll look into them further later on. So there's two main types. There's random sampling and stratified sampling. So what is random sampling? So random sampling is essentially selecting a small group of people from a population in such a way that all possible variations of this group have an equal chance of being selected. So for example, if you have a sample of say, if you have a group of 10 people in your class, let's say, right? And if you select two people, the probability that these two people are selected should be same as the probability that any other two people are selected from the rest of your group. All right, so that is what random sampling is, the main essential idea. So this is one of the key criteria for random sampling. Not only do those two people need to have an equal probability of any other two people, the individuals also need to have the same probability. All right. So random sampling can also be further divided into two types. So one is called simple random sampling, where you cannot have a replacement. So for example, if you're playing, I don't know, if you're playing a game with a group of 10 people, right? And you need to start the game, someone has to volunteer, right? So if no one volunteers, let's say the teacher picks on the student and the student refuses, right? And if the student refuses and the teacher says, all right, we don't need the person, we can just play the game as us, then it would be saying something like, a simple random sample. But if the teacher says we need to have someone else replace them with a replacement, then it's called an unrestricted random sample. All right. So the next type we'll be looking at is stratified sampling. Right. So stratified sampling is a method of selecting a method of sampling from a population by focusing on a small group of people from the population. So for example, if you want to collect data for example, you want to collect data on people's beverage preferences. So if you went to a coffee shop and asked around what's their preferred drink, they're going to say coffee, right? So you're targeting that specific group, right? Because so that is called that is stratified sampling, all right? So to do stratified sampling, we divide a population into groups called strata, all right? Strata is a key term. You could be asked about it in the exam. The plural for strata is not stratus, it is stratum. So stratum, all right? So again, once the strata is chosen, a random sampling, you can again apply random sampling from the to the strata to get stratified sampling. All right. So now sampling. Of course, now that I've given you the coffee example, for example, you probably would have noticed there was a lot of bias. So if you go into a coffee shop and ask people what's a preferred drink, they're probably going to say coffee, right? So that is a bias, right? A bias is a distortion that affects your results. It can be during the method of collection of your data or how it's being processed, right? So you have to make sure that you can identify these biases while looking at key information or text, right? Because this could be a few questions as well. There could be a few questions on this, right? We had some of these questions, similar style questions at GCSE, but it's important you make sure to read the text carefully in the exams. All right, the next thing we're going to be looking at is sampling techniques. So there are a lot of sampling techniques, not just simple and stratified sampling. Although stratified sampling is like a variation of simple random sampling, but you have a small particular group you're choosing it from. All right, let's start off with simple random sampling again. All right, so simple random sampling is when you choose a certain number of random candidates from a large population. Yeah, like we had discussed it before. So everyone must have the same chance, and if we choose three people, those three people must have the same chance as another three different people being chosen. All right. So that is an important property of simple random sampling. The next thing method we'll be looking at is systematic sampling. So systematic sampling is where you choose, say, for example, every fifth member in the population, or like, for example, in this picture, every third member. So you are trying to choose at regular intervals, sort of in a pattern. So there's not any randomness, except for maybe the first person who's being chosen, and then every third off, and then systematically after that, right? So this is systematic sampling. It could sometimes be representative of the entire population. It could not, maybe. All right, the next method we'll be looking at is cluster sampling. So cluster sampling is where we divide the group or the large population into clusters, all right? It could be based on, for example, if you're in a school, right? If you're in set 1, that would be a cluster. Set 2 would be a different cluster. Set 3 would be a different cluster. You could divide it that way, or you could be like one student from set 1, one student from set 2, one student from set 3, or all boys in one cluster, all girls in one cluster. The cluster is basically a way of dividing the population using some sort of rules, some sort of separation. And then we select our sample group by choosing the random students from those clusters, all right? Or choosing those clusters themselves entirely, because the population size is really small here. You can't choose clusters. There is a small amount of randomness because you are choosing clusters, which cluster to use are random, but again, it is not as random as simple random selection. So data is not completely random. So you could have, for example, if for example you choose two groups, right? You end up choosing set one and set two, and which most of the set one and most of set two months, for example, they enjoy the subject more than set three and set four. So that could make biases in your data if you collect regarding whether students like maths or not, right? So it is important to to consider the advantage and disadvantage of this, all right? So the next thing we'll be looking at is judgmental sampling. So judgmental sampling is usually choosing your candidates for your interview based on the opinion of an expert or your opinion. For example, if you were working for a glass making company, right, making glasses. So if you want to choose people from a population, you would probably choose those people who are wearing glasses, right? Because they are wearing glasses, and they might actually be able to give you some feedback. But it's also important to understand that the other people who are not wearing glasses actually see these people, and they might actually be able to give better feedback sometimes. So it is also important to consider who you choose and exactly why they're being chosen as well. So there could be biases induced, or there could be lack of data to come to a proper conclusion. All right. The next one we'll be looking at is snowball sampling. So snowball sampling is essentially where, let's say, you're doing a project at your school, and you need to collect some data for your project, right? Usually, what would you do? The first thing you would probably do to collect data would be create a survey and send it out to your friends and ask them to fill the survey and share it with their friends, right? That is simply the idea of snowball sampling. So you're choosing one candidate or one friend. You could maybe have multiple friends to start off with, and then they send the survey to their friends, and you collect more data overall. So this is what you call snowball sampling. So eventually you'll end up with a fairly large data set. So this is the idea of snowball sampling. The next one we're looking at is quota sampling. This is not assessed in the current exam, Edexcel exam, but I feel it might be useful to you because this was actually previously assessed in the AQA, previous exam boards for statistics. So we'll just go through it regardless. So you can just listen to this, and if you do see something in real life, you could maybe be able to understand what's going on. So quota sampling is where you choose people based on quotas. So for example, let's go back to the cluster sampling. Let's use this picture, that might be easier. So let's say all the orange colors or the peach colors are boys and all the blue are girls, right? So if it is if in a quota sample, you would say I would choose two boys and two girls. That's quota sampling. So you're allocating a certain number to represent one group and another certain number to represent another group. So it's sort of like if you have these clusters, right? Or if these six are different groups and you ask to choose one student from each of these groups as the representative or like sort of like the leader, that would be your quota sampling. You're choosing this gives a much slightly more accurate representation of the sample. But let's say if you have like I don't know a classroom with like 30 boys and like 5 girls or something, big classroom, but it won't give an accurate representation because there are more girls than boys, right? So it has to be, it depends on the sample size as well as the group sizes. All right, so you have to think about this. All right, so thank you for watching this video. We will be going through in the next video, which will be released this week soon. We'll be going through the advantages and disadvantages for each method, as this will be an important thing that will be raised in the exam, and you will have to use these to reason which method of sampling you should choose. All right? Thank you and have a good day.